Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's event, which is hosted by Manchester University Press. This evening, we are celebrating the launch of two of the latest books in our popular Manchester Capitalism series. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I'm just going to go over some brief housekeeping. So please note this event is being recorded, but only the panelists will be visible on the recording. As you have come into the virtual room, your mics have been muted and your cameras turned off. We ask you to please keep your mics muted so as not to interrupt the speakers talking. If you have a question or a comment, please put them in the chat box and we will hopefully have time to get to those towards the end of the session, which we should be finishing up about 8 o'clock. If you would like to purchase a copy of any of the books we discussed this evening, I do encourage you to sign up to the MUP newsletter. You will receive an exclusive discount code of 30% off all of the titles we discussed tonight, as well as any other MUP title on our website. I will post some links in the chat box shortly to sign up to the newsletter and to purchase copies of the book. So stay tuned for those. So without further ado, I will kick off this evening's event by introducing this evening's moderator and series author, Karel Williams. Thank you, Karel.
We've got two new books tonight, both of them in the Manchester Capitalism book series. Aeron Davis, the one author on the inside history of the Treasury since 1976, and Tom Haines-Doran on British railways and why they're broken. And I think there are two questions which relate to these books and why they fit together and how they fit together. And the first question is how and why nothing works in the UK. And the second is what, if anything, can we do about it? So next slide, please, Becca. If you actually were reading the Daily Mail last week, as I was, because if you want to find out what's going on in this country, reading the Daily Mail is a very useful thing to do. There was a column by Andrew Neil, which actually started with the phrase, "Nothing works in this country anymore," and then got completely diverted and distracted into protesters on the M25, onto why the NHS wasn't working, which scandalously, because doctors were being paid £120,000 a year and it should be working, etc., etc. The Daily Mail is not the place to go for analysis of why things are not working. And I suppose if you shift from that, there is this kind of discussion of cost of living crisis and all the rest of it. What I want to do next is very simply say, we've got a multiple crisis of livability on our hands with, if you look at that diagram, all three pillars crumbling. There's income on the red pillar, and above all, residual income after the four essentials: housing, transport, utilities, and food. And here we've got heating versus eating issues for people in the bottom two household deciles. And this morning we were told that for first-time buyers, typically they would end up paying not 30% of their disposable take-home pay on a mortgage, but 45% by next year. And apart from the income crisis, you've got the services crisis, both about the tax-funded services like health and education and the privatized utilities. 7 million on the NHS waiting list, austerity, real wage cuts, undermining recruitment and retention, utilities and infrastructure like water companies and rail, completely dysfunctional and not providing a basic service. And then if you want to look at it, there's the social infrastructure, the parks, the libraries and high streets, the things that people always emphasize and criticize when I and my colleagues do community surveys. And it's worth remembering that it's not in the news, but our parks, for example, are used, local parks are used by more than half the population every week, by 90% of those with children under the age of 6. Next slide, please. Now, against that background, we've got two interesting points of view: macro from Aeron on the Treasury, and meso or sectoral from Tom on the railways. On the Treasury side, I suppose the basics are that the UK Treasury is an economy and finance ministry combined. It has macro responsibility for tax and spend. So Jeremy Hunt's austerity package, 50% tax increases, 50% spending cuts, is the Treasury's doing. The Treasury manages government debt. It's the lead actor in privatization, outsourcing, and PFI, and it directly controls the budgets of all other departments so that it indirectly limits infrastructure investment and public sector wages. So, in a sense, the Treasury is the controller of the whole system. And then here in the railways, we have an essential service which isn't working. Privatization in '97 added shareholders when there wasn't enough money in the fare box, and the system was dependent on subsidy to provide adequate services. The franchise system allowed profit without investment or risk, as the franchisees could avoid loss by walking away, as many did. And then we have the problems about high fares and poor services, particularly on Avanti West Coast and TransPennine Express. Now let's hear from the two authors. I'll ask Aeron first and then Tom to briefly introduce their books, and then we'll go into question and answer and discussion. So Aeron first.
Yeah, the book Bankruptcy, Bubbles and Bailouts, it's very much an interview-based account. If you click, please. These are some of the key figures. I managed to interview 8 former chancellors going back to 1979. Geoffrey Howe's the first one there, and got up to Philip Hammond. And the only chancellor I didn't get to speak to was John Major, who was only there for a year and a bit. But more importantly, I got to speak to many senior officials. So I spoke to all the permanent secretaries of the Treasury going back to 1981, all the way up to the most recent Tom Scholar. And many of the most interesting conversations were not with the chancellors or the politicians, but they were with the officials behind the scenes, many of which had left and so were more free to speak their mind. It's very much a sort of interview-based, observational, qualitative study, which makes it very different. Could you just click again? Which makes it very different from the kind of sort of numbers-based accounts or political accounts, political biographies, and those sorts of things. The book starts in 1976, and it starts there with there's Callaghan and Healy. It starts there and it ends in 2016. And I see that as sort of the 40 years of the neoliberal experiment in many ways. So going from there. And the high point of that was really the late 90s, early 2000s. Perhaps you could say it started going wrong with the dot-com boom and bust. It begins in 1976 because that's when the IMF had to come and bail out the UK. They didn't actually have to bail them out in the end, but we went cap in hand. And that was when things had not been working well, and the old paradigm based on Keynesianism and everything else that had been running the economy from the 1970s was really breaking down through the 70s. And 76 was marked the change, and it wasn't just about the IMF; it was about the thinking, and the monetarists who were on the periphery had started getting involved, and they were talking to Healy and people. And then 1979, that's when the Thatcher government comes in, and things really start to change much more quickly, turning into the sort of regime that we're used to. It ends in Brexit because that's the breakdown. And of course, many aspects of neoliberalism are still here, but that's when there's a visible tearing apart of the establishment that underpinned neoliberalism in Britain. And so that's why I end it there, although the book does continue. If we go on to the next slide, the book does continue up until last year, really, because I managed to interview people for a postscript. So it's very much an economic history, a political economy, economic sociology, rather than an economist's account. So yeah, the narrative arc, it starts in 1976, the end of the Keynesian interlude, as it were. In that first chapter, you're clicking slightly ahead of me. In that first chapter, what's as important as anything else is the strengthening of the Treasury that came after 1976 and after 1979. The Treasury became all powerful because the Treasury was also seen to blame for the country being bankrupt, so it had to have more power over the rest of the government and power over policy. But through that first chapter, we realized various things are happening. The Thatcher government doesn't want various things. It doesn't want British industry in charge. It doesn't want the unions in charge. It doesn't want the government itself in charge. It wants other people in charge. But we're not quite sure who those other people are. So there are two things. One is the Treasury strengthening itself, but at the same time starting a pathway by which government has less macroeconomic intervention in government. Because underlying all this is the idea that government should not be running the economy in any way. So Thatcherism knew what it didn't want, and it had some broad principles and ideas, but it didn't have a clear roadmap. And the roadmap is mapped out in the next 3 chapters. And one of those is a city and big finance. Financialization, the explosion of the city. And it's not just the explosion of the city, but the handing over of British industry to the city. So Britain's largest companies, nationalized companies, were not just sold off, they were floated on the stock exchange. They became part of that. And through that chapter, you realize that financial control over the British economy grows in all sorts of things like corporate governments. Can you, next click, please. The second thing that replaced it was sort of globalization and government deciding it wasn't going to have British industry running, British leaders and British business running things, but international success stories, they should come and run things for us. And so there were a lot of sort of sweeteners and enticements to international capital to come in and flood in through the city, but also multinationals to come in. At the same time, they were winding down all support for British industry and deliberately saying, well, we're not going to help British industry because that's enabling the weak to maintain, and so we sell off everything, where railways come in, amongst other things. Next click, please. The third big long-term change is what's called pseudo-Keynesianism. It's a sort of adding to privatized Keynesianism and managed money trees, because as you see for the whole period, the government goes out of its way to say, well, we're not investing, we're not part of the economy, but actually spending what now amounts to hundreds of billions, well, trillions now, probably trillions now, in covert ways to prop up the economy, to prop up things and to stimulate it. And that might be the privatization process, the selling off of council houses, but it also might be PFI contracts, quantitative easing, contingent liability, as it's now called, a whole lot of other methods to actually flood money around the economy. And of course, you know, hundreds of billions in international sweeteners to entice business and keep it here or bring it over here. The next click. The next chapter is where it all falls apart in the great financial crash, where we had a failed paradigm shift. Well, what was happening wasn't working. Instead of looking at that, we had a raft of banking regulation, and in effect, we continued to try and prop up this failing economic model, and no real change happened. Takes us on to click next chapter, the coalition years in 2010, and the coalition and austerity, and we're all about propping up that system and actually gearing it up again, because all those things that I just talked about continued, but with added austerity and major cuts to government systems, government welfare and public systems. And all of that ended us and takes us to Brexit. There's a lot of arguments about Brexit, but a key argument through all of this is that the failing economic policy, the inequalities, the issues across Britain, and the Treasury itself, long-term policy, contributed fully or strongly to Brexit. Next click, please. And that then takes us on to the final chapter, which is reckless opportunists and what's happening after 2016 to the present. And again, what you have is the breakdown of the establishment battling over different economic ideas. Next final slide, please. So lots of key themes, arguments, and now. If you could just click through all of this, please. So I just wanted to say that a lot of the themes take us round and back, really. And these pictures are all from the last few years, well, ever since the Boris Johnson came in. There's a huge amount of continuity that goes through. And really, I should have a picture of Gordon Brown and Darling in there too, because Labour didn't shift very much from that. In fact, Labour elaborated on certain parts like PFI. But essentially, even with Truss and Kwarteng, and before that, what we have is repackaging and representing of Thatcherism, Dawson from the 1980s, and an attempt to prop up that system. Final click. So what we've really had is radical continuity, radical continuity. And we're still waiting for that major paradigm shift while sitting in the pot like frogs as the water boils ever harder, and things just are breaking apart now, and the establishment are in complete disarray as to where to go next. And I'll stop there. That sort of brief outline of the book. Thanks. Over to Tom.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so as has already been discussed, my book's about the railways. I guess my motivation for it, I've been studying it for a number of years, the sort of disaster of privatization. I think the thing that interested me most about the subject was that if you looked at opinion polls, everybody wanted the railways to be renationalised, even people that voted Conservative, because they clearly weren't working. And this has been the case for many years, of course. But I sort of felt that I was sort of interested in why they weren't renationalised, if that was the case. But also sort of the more I learned about it, the more I understood that just renationalising them isn't necessarily going to fix them. So my book's about how to fix them, and it isn't just about the fact that we need to renationalise them. And it's written for passengers. So I was studying this subject as part of a PhD program, but actually along the way have written some more academic stuff about it. But I did my PhD down in London, so at that time it was Virgin trains, and at that time it was still quite a bad service, and quite a few times I was stuck on the train with passengers. And on one occasion there was a terrible delay, and I got speaking to a group of passengers who were sitting around the table, and they found out that I was doing a PhD on the railway, the economics of the railways, and decided to ask me a lot of questions. And so this book's really, it's dedicated to those passengers as an example of the travelling public, really, and hoping to sort of provide information and critique of, if you like, the recent history of the railways in a way that empowers them to do something about it. So I'll let you into a little secret about my book. One of the ways we're going to have to fix the railways, and I think the previous presentation outlined this quite well, is we probably can't rely on electing a different government to do it. There probably has to be more, and the rail workers and rail passengers are going to be a big part of that. So taking one of the questions, forgotten her name, Alicia. This isn't her real photo. I just got this off the internet. Would be a bit weird to take a photo, but she represents all the passengers who are delayed, and we've heard a lot about this delays and cancellations recently, but they've been a big feature of the railways since privatization. So the graph I'm showing you here shows the blue lines, vertical lines, the percentage of trains delayed, or the percentage of trains arriving within 10 minutes or 5 minutes. And right at the start of the privatization process in the mid-90s, it was around 90%. And interestingly, you'll see that right at the other side, 2020-21, they were about 93% on time, so way better. But obviously that was COVID. Not many services were running. And that tells you something about why trains are delayed. One of the major reasons is lack of capacity. So there's always, if one train's delayed, it creates a massive knock-on effect and delays many other trains. So you need the capacity in the infrastructure as one of the main reasons to stop delays happening. And that's what we don't generally have. As you can see, just after privatization, punctuality took a huge dip. And there's different reasons behind that, but one of the main reasons was there was a significant increase in passenger numbers around that time. A lot more people started commuting, going to university, that kind of thing, using the railways, not just the railways, but the roads too. And the private companies that took over services from BR started piling on loads more services. And the inevitable result was a lot more delays on the system. But people may be aware of the history of this. A private company called Railtrack took over the infrastructure from BR. And instead of investing in the infrastructure, spent most of its spare cash, or what it thought to be spare cash, on rewarding shareholders. And that had a huge amount of problems. But the main thing that it caused was a dangerous and unmaintained network, and that resulted in ultimately a crash in 2000 at Hatfield, which led the company into bankruptcy. And this is sort of picking up on the previous presentation, talking about this idea that sort of Thatcherist economics, it wasn't just about cutting back the state, but also some political reality there, or some concern for the general economy and needing to keep things functioning to some extent. And that creating new opportunities for private finance. So, but by this time, New Labour were in charge, and instead of renationalising the railways, they went for basically a mega PFI deal with creating Network Rail. Through Network Rail, they could borrow billions and billions of pounds from the international credit markets that wouldn't appear on the government's balance sheet. And with that money, that did actually allow them to invest in the infrastructure. And you see a resurgence of punctuality into the late 2000s. But the European Union came along and spoiled their party in 2014 and said, actually, we've had a look at the accounting rules. It really is government debt that you've got there. And they forced by that time, it was the coalition government of David Cameron. They forced that government to renationalise that debt. And by that point, Network Rail had built up £34 billion worth of debt. And to put that in some perspective, that's around half of the financial black hole that was recently created by Liz Truss, although it received nowhere near the amount of media attention. But it was a massive blow to a coalition government who was hell-bent on austerity, so they had to find another £34 billion. The result of all of this was that the government itself would have to start borrowing money to pay back this debt, and they started cutting on maintenance spending for Network Rail, and the expansions needed, and there was still growing passenger demand by that point. As you can see by the number of trains planned, so that keeps going up throughout these years. But between the mid 2000s and now, there's been a massive cut in infrastructure spending, and only until COVID. There was still that increase in passenger numbers. So you had more and more trains, and once again you had cutbacks on maintenance. And now, and this goes back to what was being said before as well. There is no plan. You can't do the private finance trick again. It just isn't in any way going to work. So the government's going to have to find that money from somewhere. And that's not even talking about the improvements to services that we need. And one final slide, because I wanted to shut up. The effects of privatization on the railways in terms of public subsidy. So we think about neoliberal economics or Thatcherist economics as being about the withdrawal of the state, which it is in some ways, but it isn't necessarily the withdrawal of public spending. That's a very different matter. So we can see here these are real terms public subsidy figures for the railways going back to the mid-80s. And under BR, they ranged between something about £2 to £4 billion a year in public subsidy. And as you can see in the late 1990s into the 2000s, that started to increase quite significantly. And then in 2014, these government loans, which are apparently private sector, but they were now added to the government sheet, were then had to be added to the subsidy accounting, if you like, raising the subsidy to about £14 billion a year. So there was something like there's been something like a 5 times increase in public subsidy to the railways, arguably for a much worse service than existed before. And then COVID just made everything even worse again, because suddenly you had a couple of years of hardly anyone traveling. So any solution to the railways is going to cost a lot of money, a huge amount of money in historic terms. The only other alternative is that the thing completely collapses. And I guess the political challenge really is to say why the railways are important and why they require so much public investment. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Can I start with one obvious contrast, really? An interview-based book on the Treasury, and your book, Tom, very much built on a statistical basis. Why did you choose statistics, and why didn't you, for example, interview transport ministers or DFT officials?
That's a good question. I think I was interested in the statistics because there was more to be learned from the statistics than had been discussed, at least in the popular book. So because it's a regulated industry, there is a fair amount of information out there. It's also famously sort of the dud job in the cabinet is to be the transport secretary. So you tend to get a massive churn of talentless people in the position who really don't understand the industry at all. And in terms of the DFT, I'm not so sure, but I don't feel like it's a readily accessible place. And you certainly struggle to interview people who remember what happened 20 years ago, or if it's recent, you don't sort of have people wanting to talk about it, because I think many of them are very well aware that a lot of this stuff is an utter scandal.
Aeron, interviews, I mean, they told you so much without realizing that you were a critical interviewer. I mean, but you didn't want to look at pseudo-Keynesianism or any, you could have written the history of the Treasury around all these macro issues and the numbers, couldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, why interviews? Well, I've always done a lot of interviews with my research. I've always been fascinated with economic matters and political economy. But most accounts, I mean, a huge majority of accounts from critical political economists focus on the figures and the bigger trends and the data. I've always wanted to know what happens inside, where, what's the thinking, what's the culture, how does, what are the inspirations, what are the decision-making processes that bring us from A to B. I mean, it's always been a puzzle to me. I've talked to elites all my research career, and they often aspire to some greater glory, some greater thing, not just for themselves, of course, but for the UK. They want to do well by it, and then seem quite perplexed that things have not turned out as they thought, or it's gone a different direction. So you want to probe into that and find that out. So to me, it's much hard, as Tom said, it's very hard to interview such people which is one reason why not many people do it. And the people that do write about personalities are generally the politicians themselves and their biographies, which are very sort of centered around them, and they're the hero, and their ideas and key figures, without looking at the real day-to-day details and the real people doing the stuff, the officials and everyone else involved. So that's why interviews. So I'm trying to sort of bridge something. And I mean, the other thing is at the bottom, while I've always thought big economic trends tell a story in themselves, we want to look at decision makers and why decisions are made. And because in the end, people decide we're going to privatize, and then we're going to privatize more, or they decide we're going to go to war in Iraq. It's not just about big economic trends, it's actually ideas inside settings, and you want to sort of tear those apart or to see what those are. So that's why interviews.
Right. I mean, I was quite interested then that the two, in a sense, approaches produced slightly different analyses or emphases. In Aeron's book, one of the problems is city think technocrats, you know, mentalities in a sense, even of people like Nick Macpherson or Tom Scholar, who are permanent secretaries at the top of the thing, who are clearly not in any sense corrupt individuals. Whereas Tom's book, and there was a phrase there, Tom, about the powerful tie-up between government, industry, and private finance that directs rail policy, which suggests that, you know, it's less a problem of mentality and more of interests dominating things. Now, this isn't completely binary either or, but Tom, do you think that it is interests, you know, is it industry, is it finance which has captured things for material reasons?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, if you're wedded to so going back to sort of the initial crisis of privatization, which, like I say, was about 3 or 4 years after it started, they really did have a choice. They could have renationalised the railways at that point, and actually the Labour government, who was in power at the time, had sort of stood on the platform to do that in the 1997 election. And they did, of course, nationalise a hell of a lot in the banking crisis not so long after that. But I feel like, so there was a sort of, if we're thinking about ideology and the importance of ideas, this Gordon Brown's fiscal rules was probably some of the most ideological government we've seen in the past few years, alongside austerity and some other things, where everything has to be subservient to meeting you know, overall targets. And it doesn't matter if you maybe it's even good if you can meet those targets in a way that sort of works against the principles of what you're doing. As long as you're meeting them, you can say we've met these rules. The only way to do that was to vastly open the railways up to some massive financial fix, and the only place to go for that is to you know, as everyone says in his book, the big four accounting firms, the merchant banks, and they will fix it for you. That they will work with you, and they will make sure you put the right guarantees that they will receive their income back, and they will do it. So I think there's a sort of original sin, if you like, in terms of those having these very straitjacketed fiscal rules, and then sort of being completely fine politically with doing anything necessary. But obviously, in the context of, and this goes back to sort of the broad, you know, analysis of the economy, increased financialization. So financialization, you know, is an idea, I suppose, and it has been done through institutions. But it's also been about the innovation in the financial sector, the sheer proliferation of financial markets that enabled this. Without all that stuff happening, you would have never had Network Rail. It wouldn't have been possible to have Network Rail in the 1970s.
Right. Aeron, you know, that's part of your explanation, isn't it? The city was to hand with a ready-made set of practices, actors, people who were available for hire. But the mentality, particularly of the technocrats and of people like the permanent secretaries.
Yeah, I think mentalities are very important, and I've always thought the culture of organisations and the culture at the top, the culture of the networks, is very important, because people tend to end up thinking this is how it is or how it should be. So they fall back onto certain processes and certain ideas and certain responses every time. And that's the default setting. So those cultures are clearly infected or guided by the city, because you have a lot of city people, a lot of exchange between the city and the Bank of England and the Treasury in terms of personnel going back and forth. But I guess another aspect is that technocratic. We have to be neutral and independent, and but somehow that neutrality is guided and created out of that nexus of the city and Bank of England. It's also very London-centric, as we all know, because none of these people ever leave London really, and they don't go into the regions unless they're forced to. So I think that all guides it, and I mean, the other thing to say is on a day-to-day basis is they fall back on those things, but they're also very much, it's a very fast-moving world in the Treasury often. There's an awful lot to do, and that's when there is no crisis. And so you fall back on these default ideas, default settings, default ways of doing things, which have been guided by the larger culture. And the big paradigm shift, as I say, was at the end of the 70s, early 80s, and there was a very set culture before that in the post-war period, and there was another set culture before the Keynesian regime came in the 30s. So that really does, when in the fire of working in the Treasury, that's what happens. So I've gone on too long, but that's trying to understand how the culture influences the mentality of day-to-day processes, even by very smart, able, intelligent people at the top.
Yeah, can I come back at both of you? You emphasized that rail nationalization, for example, you know, all the evidence is that this is what the public wants. As you said, this is not in itself going to solve the problem, but this is what the public wants. But this is not on the agenda. Is this because of the default, so to speak? Why doesn't Labour now offer rail nationalisation?
Yeah, well, I'm still really unsure, and I keep thinking every time I do something like this, I better go back and check to see if it's just me being unsure, or if they have actually clarified what they meant. But I think that their policy is to wait for contracts to run out and gradually renationalize that way, although they won't renationalize quite a lot of it, because it's the rolling stock, for example, is owned under decades-long arrangements by private companies and that kind of thing. So yeah, so why doesn't? So I think there's a sort of, I think there's a broader politics to it, which is to say that, okay, rail renationalization might be really popular, but how is it going to play with the markets if we do it? So we just saw a government fall in reaction to animal spirits, if you like, of people who deal in bonds internationally, who lost faith in the British government because they were planning to spend money that they didn't have. Now, that money was going to be spent on giving it to rich people, but the other way that it could happen is that they'd give that money to poor people. But presumably the reaction of the bond markets would be the same. So this sort of world where we live in, where economic credibility, in quotes, becomes so important, I think is part of it. And if you look at some of the arguments that happened about what should happen with Network Rail, and should rail track have been saved and stuff, that the government were very concerned that they shouldn't make the shareholders of Railtrack pay too much, even though they'd profited massively over the past 3 or 4 years. And that was all about not spooking the markets. And so I feel like the last few months has shown that there is some truth in that. So I think to an extent it sort of feels like either you do a little bit of reform and a little bit of renationalization and probably won't solve the problem, but we're not going to take on this, There's another school of thought to say, we are one of the richest countries in the world. It's quite clear that this system, whether it's by choice of each government or whether it's foisted upon us by the international markets, is broken, and surely it's in everyone's interests if some of these foundational parts of the economy actually worked. And that's breaking out of the paradigm that we've talked about. I mean, can an individual government break itself out of the paradigm? Maybe they would get away with just the railways, but to some extent, the railways have been symbolic of the whole thing, and not just in terms of financialization and privatization not working, but also, really importantly, I think, in terms of the whole story of Thatcherism, neoliberalism, about crushing unions, and that potentially being something that's starting to change to some extent.
Can I come back to you, Aeron? Because I mean, Tom is explaining, in a sense, what you'd call the default and the power of the bond markets and all the rest of that. I mean, I think the thing that's really striking about the interviews is you'd expect more kind of penitence, guilt, knowledge that things hadn't turned out well, so to speak, from your interviewees. Whereas, there are odd signs here and there that maybe the decline of British manufacturing was, basically rather sad. But the idea that, in a sense, the whole period from 1976 to 2016 is the arc of an experiment which has ended in failure. That doesn't seem to strike your interviewees, does it?
That's not entirely so. So I wanted to just pick up on a point from what Tom said, because the whole privatization thing and the whole changing paradigm, which is relevant here, it's not just the bond markets. I think, putting on my politics and political communication hat, politicians know that we'd like to nationalize lots of things again, but they also know in their focus groups and stuff that people want to pay less taxes. They don't want to pay more taxes, and every government which suggests that you might increase taxation will get less seats at the next election. But on top of that, if you're going to put your money somewhere, the NHS comes higher. There's a pecking order. The NHS, and then probably school education. Railways come sort of further down. And as we all know, unfortunately, higher education comes very low down there somewhere. So there's a pecking order for public money to be spent, if it is. But yeah, but penitence. I mean, funnily enough, the Labour people. I mean, there's another point. Sorry, the Labour people. Some of the Labour, I always remember a quote from one of them, Geoffrey Robinson, said to me, we're all old Labour, We really were, except for Ed Balls, who did more to do the policy in the Labour years than anyone else. But but we never wanted to be seen as old Labour. We had to be seen as new Labour. And the Starmerites now are doing the same thing. It's the same playbook, which is you don't want to look like an old-fashioned Labour Party that's out of touch and is going to be bashed by the right-wing press all the time. But sorry, to go back to your question about why penitence, funnily enough, a lot of the officials and the aging Tories I spoke to were very penitent. Not very penitent, but realised a lot had gone wrong. I mean, when you've left, it's okay. I had a wonderful conversation with Ken Clarke, who basically sounded like Jeremy Corbyn at times, but I couldn't put that much of the interview into the book. Philip Hammond was very sort of, it's all gone wrong, really. Well, not capitalism, but the ruling government has all gone wrong and it's all a mess. And one or two of the officials, I had quite, well, actually several officials, not Tom Scholar, because at that point he was in a very senior position and he couldn't really say much, though he did say a few things, but other officials around Tom Scholar and before were quite reflective that it had gone wrong. Why it gone wrong, I don't know. They weren't always clear, but they realized that they had gone wrong and we'd gone way in certain directions. A lot were very, why have we sold off all our British industry? It was always a question in my mind, they said. We were always concerned, but then we never did anything because that didn't fit the new paradigm. And you talk to other people like Adair Turner saying, I'm very critical now of economic policy, but when you're in the fire of the moment, you go with a consensus. It's not the time to throw up what everyone thinks is standard responses to whatever it is. So I think there is, but there is a much greater lack of will or ability to fight the dominant consensus, which is very entrenched and very linked to power across Britain. The financial sector, most CEOs of top companies believe the same thing, even if they really hate the financial sector itself. Various quarters of the elite establishment still sort of think, this paradigm is completely broken down, but we couldn't possibly have something else because that would be worse. And that's where we are. They know it's wrong, they know it's not working, but they couldn't bear other ideas, but they haven't really investigated them. They haven't thought of things like the foundational economy or other ways of managing things from a bottom up or a devolved nature.
Right. So, this is very depressing because on the whole, you both paint a picture of a kind of miasma, which actually envelops everything and inhibits any kind of purposive action. Is there any way out of the quagmire? I mean, Tom, you had this thing in the book about getting the question right and what should the railways be for the mid 20th century. Is that simply an intellectual question, or do you think that could, given the miasma, the inability to develop new ideas or to break out, is this simply, a nice point made in a book, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see the situation as all that depressing, because I take the opinion that that the people that have been running this country, yes, that they've tried an economics experiment that hasn't worked overall. It's worked for some people very well, of course, but is it working for society? Can they rely to be elected in general elections, that kind of thing? Probably not anymore. So if they're struggling intellectually, then that opens an opportunity for others to come along and to shape the future. And as we all know, the people who ran the Treasury before Thatcher got in almost all got replaced because they had a slightly more socially conscious view of how to run an economy. But the things that have been happening in terms of new political ideas are all for there to see. I mean, they're just not in government. So the school strikes around climate change, for example, the railway strikes this year, you know, as much as a failure as it was, some of the ideas that came out from Corbynism and that movement. So I think so I'll go back to the question of sort of how can we justify around probably more like 7 times the amount of public subsidy to run a worse railway service than we had in the 1980s. And what do we actually want from it? And I think you have to start from some basic principles. So people can choose their own starting point, but the one I chose in the book is the climate emergency and the inequality and cost of living crisis. And when you try and put solutions together that meet those, that's been termed a just transition, which is another term that's come along in quite recently, but is very popular. And you have to think about everything when you think about that, so it makes it very difficult to write about in a book, of course. But you have to sort of think about, okay, we have a certain way of doing things in society. Some of that involves stuff like the railways. We have a certain amount of time, we have a certain amount of energy we can use and ways to produce that energy. How are we going to avert the worst effects of climate change? So the climate change is happening and will get worse whatever we do now. The Holocene, which is the period that human civilization has grown up in, is basically going to be guaranteed to have gone very soon. And we're heading to something like 4 degrees of warming, which will likely bring another 8 degrees within 80 years. So it's a desperate emergency, and we all have to be thinking about whatever it is that we're writing about or involved in, how we're going to deal with it in that particular sector or parts of our lives. So I start to propose a sort of, not a solution to that, but some things to think about. And I think one thing that has come out of recent years that's sort of started to become a little bit like it might be a paradigm is this new obsession with infrastructure projects, which was sort of, I think, a reaction to austerity, and it was part of the levelling up so-called agenda as well. And of course, it's one of the reasons that the mega project, which is HS2, has been partly funded. Now, I don't really talk about HS2, but thinking about the sort of things that we need to do, to me, it doesn't make any sense. And if you look at climate scientists and those involved with the climate side of transport, it doesn't make sense to us that our solution to this is to build loads and loads more stuff. The key questions are, what are we doing at the moment that we have to stop doing? And so one of them is basically mostly stopping flying. The other one is massive contributor to climate change and inequality, which is the car-based society that we live in. And how are we going to solve those problems if we don't have time to build loads of infrastructure to replace those forms of transport? Okay. Those are the key questions in my last chapter. Sorry, I'm going on a bit, but just to give you a flavour really of the depth of the sort of meta crisis that we're in, and the way that we're going to have to, some of the even left-wing solutions, if you like, or social democrat solutions to it, and this goes back to your comment about new Labour not wanting to look like old Labour, are redundant, and they were building big industries and getting ourselves out that way and redistributing some of the income. That's not possible if we want to survive. So there has to be new thinking. Okay, the inspiration is going to come from below, I think.
Right. Now, Aeron, last word, because we're running short on time.
Sorry,
there's a view there that that the change will come from outside government in a sense, and part of the argument in your book is we need a real political change and economic paradigm shift, and there are no new ideas, you say at one point in the book. How do you think about this question of, are there fixes? What are the fixes, Aeron?
It's not necessarily that there are no new ideas. There's lots out there. The Green New Deal and the foundational economy, and there are many others. It's just that they're not there at the top. They're not accepted at the top. But you can see that the green ideas have finally got through to the Labour Party to a degree in the latest announcements. So yeah, I mean, we do need those ideas, and I mean, to me, my answers are about systems and about cultures and about breaking those down. And I always go back to those systems and how there's an inbuilt bias, the mobilization of bias, to use very old political terms, which continually go back to entrenched interests. So whatever the decision-making process is, so really we need to look at those wider decision-making processes, those inputs, and the accountability of people at the top. So, I mean, in the book, I talk about very briefly, which is breaking up the Treasury. So it's not a finance and an economics department, because it has too much power in that respect. But also devolving it very much across the regions, which I know you're a favour of, Karel, because local economies lose out and local issues lose out, and really they need to be, it can't be all run from the centre in London and London thinking. But I also go back to reckless opportunists, actually, and the wider political and establishment decision-making processes across business, finance, and politics. And really, those things, those systems need to change. We need to have much greater transparency, tackle great conflicts of interest, work on checks and balances, stop all these people from self-policing themselves and not really being punished for crashing things and worse. We need proper neutral funded public information. It's those sort of systems. It can't be a stitch up at the centre across establishment interests, which is what it always is, and decision making comes down to. And so if you can break up that sort of oligopoly of information and decision making at the centre in London in various ways, perhaps that can push us in other directions on a more regular basis, allow other ideas in and allow other systems to develop. So, big project, I know. But.
Yeah, so that's a glimpse of opportunism at the end of our session, with Tom convinced that there's room for bottom-up pressure from outside government, and Aeron interested in radical devolution, which is very different from the kind of thing that the Treasury has supervised with the mayoral system and city deals. So two worthwhile books, well worth reading, and together I think they do give us a view of why and how we're in the mess we're in, why nothing works, and maybe some indications as to how we can get out of this mess. Thank you very much, and off you go to a bookstore or wherever and buy yourself a copy of both these books. Thank you very much.
Thank you.